In San Ignacio's sun-baked historic downtown, a 72-year-old black jazz musician was about to face two uniformed predators. A charity street fair turned deadly when officers Brent Keller and Dean Harlow decided to make an example of Elijah Turner. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical fairgoer. For decades, he'd been a U.S. Air Force veteran, martial arts world champion, and Hollywood's quiet storm known for training law enforcement in real-world combat and restraint. When Keller and Harlow grabbed Elijah and shoved him into a vendor's table, they had no idea they were stepping into a public reckoning with a man who'd spent a lifetime dismantling bullies. Norris's calm, methodical response would unleash a chain of events that would ripple far beyond the fairgrounds. What began as a small-town summer fair would become a viral flashpoint. San Ignacio would never be the same after a legend stood up to the law. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Heat rose from the pavement in visible waves, distorting the horizon where Esperanza Street met the cloudless Texas sky. The charity street fair sprawled across 6 blocks of San Ignacio's historic downtown. A patchwork of tents, booths, and makeshift stages that transformed the border town's dusty main drag into something vibrant, despite the punishing August sun. Elijah Turner dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, the crisp white linen a stark contrast against his dark skin, weathered by 72 years of living. His wide-brimmed straw hat cast a shadow across eyes that had seen enough of the world to know its ugliness, yet still chose to see its beauty. "Mr. Turner, you gotta try this." Tyrell Jackson bounced on the balls of his feet beside the old musician, his 14-year-old frame practically vibrating with excitement. The boy thrust a plastic fork loaded with golden brown pastry toward his mentor. Velasquez made it special. Behind the folding table draped in a red checked cloth, Maria Velasquez beamed with pride. Her boot adorned with a hand-painted banner reading, "Abuela's Recipes," had drawn a steady stream of customers all afternoon. "Tyrell, slow down before you wear yourself out," Elijah chuckled, accepting the offering. "It's too hot to be bouncing around like you got springs in your shoes." The cobbler melted on his tongue sweet peaches, brown sugar, and a hint of cinnamon. Elijah closed his eyes briefly in appreciation. "Well?" Maria prompted, tucking a strand of silver-streaked hair behind her ear. At 58, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had built something from nothing. Her small bakery, now a community fixture. "Tastes like memories," Elijah replied, his voice carrying the smooth timbre that had once filled jazz clubs from New Orleans to Chicago. "Like summer evenings when the world was young." Maria laughed. "Always the poet, Elijah." Her eyes drifted past him, hardening slightly. "Looks like our local heroes have arrived." Elijah didn't need to turn to know who she meant. The subtle shift in the crowd's energy told him everything. Conversation quieting, parents instinctively drawing children closer, the collective tension that spread like a drop of ink in water. Officers Brent Keller and Dean Harlow cut through the crowd, their uniforms pressed and gleaming despite the heat. Keller led the way, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and mirrored sunglasses that reflected back anyone who dared make eye contact. Harlow trailed behind, lankier and perpetually nervous, his gaze darting around as though cataloging potential threats. "They're supposed to be keeping us safe," Tyrell muttered, the excitement draining from his voice. "My dad says they just make trouble where there isn't any." Elijah placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your father's a wise man." He nodded toward a small area where teenagers had set up a simple stage. "Why don't you go check on your friends? Think I heard them warming up." As Tyrell reluctantly moved away, Elijah caught sight of another figure, sitting alone at a small table beneath the shade of a mesquite tree. The man wore a simple blue button-down shirt and jeans, nothing that called attention. But there was something in his posture, a stillness, that seemed purposeful rather than relaxed. Chuck Norris. Elijah had recognized him immediately when he'd arrived an hour earlier. The man was older now than in his action movies, but carried himself with the same quiet dignity. He'd ordered lemonade from a nearby stand and taken a seat away from the main crowd, seemingly content to observe the fair without fanfare. Now Chuck's gaze tracked the two officers as they moved through the crowd. Elijah noticed the slight narrowing of his eyes, the subtle shift in his posture, the way he set his cup down without looking, attention fully captured. Keller stopped to speak with a group of teenagers, his body language immediately confrontational. The boys, none older than 16, straightened their postures, hands visible, faces carefully neutral. The dance of the powerless before power. "They're like vultures circling," Maria whispered, "arranging pastries that didn't need arranging. Just waiting for someone to make a wrong move. Not everyone wears a badge for the right reasons." Elijah agreed, his voice low. "Well, they can circle somewhere else. I've got permits for everything." Maria straightened a stack of napkins. "And if they try to hassle any of my customers, they'll learn my English gets real good when I'm angry." Elijah smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. He'd lived in San Ignacio long enough to know how this dance worked. Keller and Harlow had built their reputation on selective enforcement harassment, disguised as maintaining order, targeting those least likely to complain or be believed if they did. "Looks like they're coming this way," Maria murmured, nodding toward the officers who had finished intimidating the teenagers and were now scanning the crowd with predatory intent. Elijah saw the moment Keller spotted him, the slight pause, the tilt of the head, the whispered comment to Harlow. He felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. "Mr. Turner," Keller called out, voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "Fancy seeing you out in this heat. Thought your kind preferred the shade." Maria stiffened beside him, hands gripping the edge of her table. Across the way, Chuck Norris set down his lemonade, watching. The band on the small stage had begun to play a hesitant jazz standard that seemed to hang in the sweltering air. The notes of "Round Midnight" drifted across the fair, counterpoint to the tension beginning to build. Elijah turned slowly to face the approaching officers, his expression carefully neutral, the dignity of 72 years wrapped around him like armor. "Afternoon, officers," he said calmly, tipping his hat slightly. "Beautiful day for a fair, isn't it? Beautiful day to keep an eye on things," Officer Keller replied, stepping into Elijah's space. Up close, his breath carried the scent of mint gum barely masking stale coffee. Lots of cash boxes around, lots of opportunities for sticky fingers. The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. A few nearby fairgoers slowed their pace, attention caught by the confrontation brewing beneath the red and white striped awning of Maria's booth. "I've been right here eating Miss Velasquez's fine cooking," Elijah replied evenly. "So unless you think I've grown extra hands in my old age, I don't see how I could be causing trouble." Keller's smile tightened. "Got quite a mouth on you for someone your age." "I find wisdom and words tend to accumulate together," Elijah said. The slight tremor in his hands was the only outward sign of his tension. Behind Keller, Officer Harlow shifted his weight from foot to foot, scanning the growing audience, his hand resting casually on his holster. The gesture wasn't lost on the bystanders, who maintained a careful distance. Maria stepped around her table, wiping her hands on her apron. "Officers, can I interest you in some cobbler on the house for our local police?" Her smile was strained, her attempt at diffusing the situation transparent. "Don't need handouts," Keller said, without looking at her. "Just making sure everyone's behaving." He tapped Elijah's chest with 2 fingers. "Especially folks with records." 20 years ago, Elijah had been arrested at a peaceful protest against the closure of the community center. The charges had been dismissed. But in a town like San Ignacio, such histories were never truly erased. "That case was thrown out before it ever saw a courtroom," Elijah said. his voice still steady despite the public provocation. As you well know, Officer Keller. Still took the ride downtown, didn't you? Keller's smirk widened. Spent some time in our accommodations. Across the way, Chuck Norris set his empty cup aside and leaned forward slightly. Elbows on knees, watching with increasing intensity. His stillness seemed to gather weight, like a storm cloud before rainfall. Tyrell had reappeared at the edge of the growing crowd, his young face tight with worry. He caught Elijah's eye, and the old musician gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Stay back. Why don't you empty your pockets, old-timer? Harlow spoke up, his voice higher than Keller's, with a nervous edge. Just so we can be sure you haven't been collecting donations of your own. I don't believe I'm under any obligation to do that, Elijah replied, the first hint of steel entering his voice. You refusing a direct request from an officer? Keller stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over Elijah. That sounds like interference to me. Maria had pulled out her phone and was holding it at waist level, camera clearly recording. There are children present, officers, she said quietly. And many witnesses. You threatening us, ma'am? Keller turned his mirrored gaze toward her. Because interfering with police business is a crime. One I'd hate to see you charged with. Recording police is my legal right, Maria replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hand. Rights, Keller scoffed. Everyone's a lawyer these days. He turned back to Elijah. Empty your pockets, now. More phones had appeared in the crowd, held aloft by people who sensed trouble brewing. The band had stopped playing, the absence of music making the confrontation seem louder, more immediate. I've done nothing wrong, Elijah said, standing his ground. Keller's response was swift and disproportionate. He grabbed Elijah's arm and yanked him forward, sending the older man stumbling against the edge of Maria's table. Pastries toppled, and Elijah barely caught himself from falling. That's police brutality, Tyrell shouted, pushing forward despite Elijah's earlier warning. You stay back, kid, Harlow warned, stepping toward the teenager. Unless you want to join him. Leave the boy alone. Elijah straightened, adjusting his hat which had been knocked askew. This is between you and me, it seems. Should have just done what you were told, Keller said, reaching for Elijah's arm again. Now I'm going to have to search you myself. You have no probable cause, called a woman from the crowd, her voice shaking despite her courage. Cause is whatever I say it is. Keller snapped back, tightening his grip on Elijah's arm until the older man winced. That's how it works in this town. Let him go, Maria demanded, her phone still recording. He's 70. 2 years old, for God's sake. Age doesn't exempt you from the law, Harlow replied, puffing out his chest. We're just doing our jobs. Your job or your hobby? Elijah asked quietly, looking Keller directly in the eyes. Because sometimes I wonder if you can tell the difference anymore. The comment struck a nerve. Keller's face flushed red above his collar, and he shoved Elijah roughly against the table again. Think you're smart? Think you can disrespect an officer of the law? His voice had risen, drawing even more attention. Maybe a night in lockup will remind you how things work around here. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, but no one stepped forward. Fear was a powerful deterrent, and Keller's reputation preceded him. No one except one person. A chair scraped against concrete as Chuck Norris finally stood. He removed his sunglasses, folded them deliberately, and placed them on the table. Then he began walking toward the confrontation, his movements unhurried but purposeful. People noticed him immediately, double takes and whispers spreading through the crowd like ripples in still water. Is that? Can't be. Holy shit. That's Chuck Norris. Keller and Harlow, focused on Elijah, hadn't yet registered the approaching figure or the shift in the crowd's energy. But Elijah had. Over Keller's shoulder, he watched the legend approach, and the faintest smile touched the corner of his mouth. Something funny, old man? Keller demanded, giving Elijah another rough shake. Not funny, Elijah replied, his dignity intact, despite the manhandling. Just thinking that sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. Justice? Keller laughed. In this town, I am justice. It was at that exact moment that Chuck Norris stopped a few feet away, standing silently, waiting to be noticed. Tyrell saw him first, his young face transforming from anger to awe in an instant. That's Chuck Norris, he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The name rippled through the crowd, and Harlow turned first, his expression cycling rapidly from confusion to recognition to alarm. He nudged Keller, who was still focused on intimidating Elijah. Brent, Harlow hissed. We've got company. Keller turned, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. The expression froze when he saw who stood watching. For a long moment, no one spoke. The crowd had gone eerily quiet. The ambient sounds of the fair children laughing, music from distant speakers, the sizzle of food on grills suddenly seemed muted and far away. Chuck Norris stood perfectly still, his presence alone commanding attention. At 85, his face carried more lines than in his action hero days, but his posture remained straight, his gaze steady and evaluating. He wore no visible expressions, just a calm, measured assessment of the situation before him. Keller recovered first, releasing Elijah's arm and turning fully to face the unexpected celebrity. A new tension coiled in his stance, something between defensiveness and bravado. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Well, he said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Look who decided to join our little discussion. The Karate Kid himself. The attempted joke fell flat in the weighted silence. No one laughed, no one moved. Sir, Harlow attempted, his voice unnaturally high. This is police business. We're going to need you to step back. Chuck didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes clear and focused moved from the officers to Elijah, noting the older man's rumpled shirt, the way he was carefully massaging his arm where Keller's grip had left marks. Then back to Keller, measuring everything about the officer's stance, his expression, the barely contained aggression in his frame. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Keller shifted his weight, acutely aware of the phone's recording, the whispers building in the crowd. You got something to say? Keller finally demanded, his hand drifting toward his belt. Or you just here to stare? Chuck remained silent, which somehow made Keller more agitated than any response might have. You know, I always wondered about guys like you, Keller continued, his voice rising, playing to the crowd now. All those fancy moves in the movies? Choreographed fights? Stunt doubles? Special effects. He took a step toward Chuck. Makes me wonder how much is real and how much is Hollywood magic. Someone in the crowd gasped. Phones lifted higher, recording every moment. Brent, Harlow muttered, a warning in his voice. Maybe we should just… No, I'm curious. Keller cut him off. We've got a real-life action hero here. I'd like to know if he's got anything besides acting skills. He gestured toward Elijah. This man was interfering with police business. You planning to interfere too? Chuck's eyes never left Keller's face, but he still said nothing. The silent assessment was clearly unnerving the officer, whose neck was now flushed red above his collar. What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Keller taunted. Or maybe you only know lines someone else wrote for you? From the edge of the crowd, Tyrell's young voice suddenly rang out. Chuck Norris doesn't need lines. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the onlookers. Keller's head snapped toward the sound, his face darkening. Who said that? He demanded. Step forward. But now another voice called from elsewhere in the crowd, leave the kid alone. And another, Yeah. Why don't you pick on someone your own size? The mood was shifting palpably. What had been fearful observation was transforming into something bolder, more defiant. Maria still held her phone steady, recording everything, her expression set with determination. Keller sensed the change and didn't like it. His hand moved to rest openly on his holster now, a not-so-subtle reminder of his authority. "This is still a police matter," he announced loudly. "Anyone interfering will be arrested for obstruction." "Obstruction of what?" Elijah spoke up, his voice carrying despite its softness. "I was eating cobbler, Officer Keller. Nothing more." "You were seen acting suspiciously," Harlow insisted, though his confidence was visibly wavering. "The only suspicious behavior I've seen," Chuck Norris finally spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying easily across the hushed crowd, "is 2 officers harassing an elderly man without cause." The simple statement, delivered without dramatic intonation or posturing, somehow carried more weight than any shouted accusation could have. A murmur ran through the crowd. Keller's eyes narrowed. "You challenging my authority, Norris?" "I'm questioning your judgment," Chuck replied evenly. "And your conduct." "My conduct?" Keller's laugh was harsh. "You're the one inserting yourself into official police business." He stepped closer to Chuck, using his slightly greater height to look down at the older man. "Maybe all those movie fights have you confused about how things work in the real world." "I was in the real world before you were born," Chuck said quietly. "Served my country in the Air Force. Trained police officers in martial arts for decades." A slight pause. "Including proper restraint techniques." The pointed remark hit home. Keller's jaw tightened. "This isn't one of your movies," he said, voice dropping to a threatening register. "There's no director yelling 'cut' if things get rough." "No," Chuck agreed. "There isn't." The tension between them was electric now. The crowd sensed it, the energy building like a thunderstorm. Phones captured every moment, every word. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" Tyrell began chanting, his young voice clear and defiant. The chant caught like wildfire, spreading through sections of the crowd. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" Keller's face contorted with anger. Being publicly challenged was bad enough, being upstaged by a celebrity was intolerable. "You think you're tough?" he snarled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think those movie stunts make you special? Why don't you prove it?" He gestured to the open space between them. "Right here. Right now. Show us what Chuck Norris can really do." The crowd's chanting faltered as people processed the officer's direct challenge. Chuck didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he looked past Keller to Elijah. "Are you all right, sir?" "I'm fine," Elijah replied with quiet dignity. "Though my arm might disagree tomorrow." Chuck nodded once, then returned his gaze to Keller. "I'm not here to fight you, officer. I'm here to witness how you're treating a senior citizen in full public view." "Witness all you want," Keller sneered. "Badge trumps fame, old man." With deliberate calm, Chuck removed his jacket, folded it neatly, and handed it to Maria, who accepted it with wide eyes. "Badge doesn't trump right and wrong," Chuck said simply. "Never has." The crowd's chanting resumed, louder now. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" Keller unclipped his badge, held it out for a moment, then dropped it on the ground between them. The metal made a dull sound against the pavement. "How about man to man then?" he challenged. "No badge. No movies. Just you and me." Chuck looked down at the discarded badge, then back at Keller. "That badge isn't just a piece of metal," he said, his voice carrying to the furthest observers. "It's a promise to protect people. All people." He nodded toward Elijah. "Including him. Last chance, Norris." Keller's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Back down and walk away. Or show everyone here what you're really made of." Chuck's expression remained unchanged, neither angry nor afraid. Just focused, present, and absolutely certain. "I'm not the one who needs to prove anything today," he said. That was when Keller lunged forward, patience exhausted, restraint abandoned. The real confrontation had begun. Keller moved with the overconfidence of a man who believed his strength and badge had always been enough. His first swing was wide and telegraphed a right hook aimed at Chuck's jaw with enough force behind it to knock down someone half Chuck's age. It never landed. With a minimal shift of his upper body, Chuck let the punch sail past his face. No wasted movement, no dramatic dodge, just the precise amount of motion needed to make Keller's attack miss its target completely. The crowd gasped. Several people clapped involuntarily. A woman near the front whispered loudly, "Did you see that?" while the man beside her nodded, mouth slightly open. Keller stumbled slightly from the momentum of his missed punch, his face registering surprise followed quickly by embarrassment. The confidence that had radiated from him moments before flickered like a candle in wind. He recovered his balance, shifting his weight between his feet as he reassessed the older man standing before him. "Lucky dodge," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Chuck remained silent. His stance relaxed, yet perfectly balanced. His eyes never left Keller's, tracking every subtle shift in the officer's posture. There was no triumph in his expression, no mockery, just focused attention, like a master craftsman fully engaged with his work. Tyrell edged closer to Maria, who was still filming everything. "He didn't even move much," the boy whispered excitedly. "Just, like, a little bit to the side." "Efficiency," Elijah commented quietly from nearby. "No wasted energy." Keller launched a second attack, a combination of jabs that might have intimidated the usual citizens of San Ignacio. His technique wasn't terrible. He'd clearly had some training, and relied on it when his size and badge weren't enough. The punches came fast, each aimed to hurt, to dominate, to put Chuck in his place. Chuck parried each strike with small, efficient movements of his forearms, never striking back, simply redirecting Keller's energy away from himself. The economy of motion made the officer's attacks look increasingly desperate and clumsy by contrast. Where Keller's movements were fueled by anger and pride, Chuck's were guided by decades of discipline, and practiced the difference between someone who had trained to intimidate and someone who had mastered an art. "Fight back," Keller growled, frustration building in his voice. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. "Or are you too old to do more than dodge?" Chuck remained silent, his breathing calm and controlled, his focus absolute. Each movement was deliberate, not showy or exaggerated. Just precisely what was necessary, and nothing more. He gave no indication that Keller's taunts affected him in any way. The crowd had grown larger, word spreading through the fair about what was happening. Parents lifted children onto shoulders for a better view. Teenagers pushed to the front. Phones held high to capture every moment. The air thrummed with tension and excitement. "This is better than the movies," someone murmured from the crowd. "That's because it's real," another voice answered. Maria continued filming, her free hand occasionally covering her mouth when Keller came particularly close to landing a blow. Elijah watched with a mixture of concern and something like vindication, his experienced eyes seeing beyond the surface confrontation to the deeper currents at work, the symbolic battle between bullying force and disciplined restraint. Tyrell had pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his expression one of pure awe. He had seen every Chuck Norris movie his grandfather owned, watched them repeatedly until he could quote lines by heart. But this quiet, precise reality was something altogether different and more profound. Keller's frustration mounted with each failed attack. He was used to people cowering, to the weight of his badge and the threat of his strength being enough. But Chuck stood unintimidated, unmoved except by his own choosing, and the officer's confidence began to crack further under the pressure of his impotence. "What's wrong, Norris?" he taunted, circling slightly to find a new angle of attack. "Afraid to throw a punch? Afraid you'll break a hip?" A few nervous laughs rippled through parts of the crowd. Most remained silent, watching intently, feeling the shift in power happening before their eyes. "He's trying to make him angry," Elijah observed quietly to Maria. "Trying to make him sloppy." "Will it work?" she asked, never lowering her phone. Elijah shook his head slightly. "I don't think Mr. Norris has been sloppy a day in his life." Keller feinted left, then delivered a hard right cross, aimed at Chuck's temple blow, that would have ended the confrontation had it connected. Chuck slipped the punch with such minimal movement that it seemed to the watching crowd that Keller had somehow missed from point-blank range. Before the officer could recover, Chuck executed a simple palm strike to Keller's sternum, not hard enough to injure, just enough to create space and send a message. Keller stumbled back 2 steps, his eyes widening in surprise. It was the first time Chuck had done anything other than defend, and the precision of it was unnerving. "That all you got?" Keller snarled, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. Chuck's expression remained unchanged. No anger, no exertion, just focused assessment. He had resumed his neutral stance, making no move to press his advantage. Harlow, seeing his partner's growing frustration, and perhaps sensing the changing mood of the crowd, decided to even the odds. He began circling to Chuck's left, looking for an opening, his hand resting on his own baton. "2 against 1, someone called from the crowd. "Real brave, officers." Harlow's face flushed, but he continued his flanking maneuver. His movements were less confident than Keller's, his training less ingrained. He was a follower, not a leader. More dangerous for his unpredictability than his skill. Chuck was aware of Harlow's approach without having to turn his head. Years of training had honed his peripheral awareness to the point where it was almost a sixth sense. He adjusted his stance slightly, preparing to deal with threats from 2 directions. Keller, seeing his partner moving into position, allowed himself a tight smile. "Not so confident now, are you?" he said. "This isn't Hollywood. No script saying you win in the end." Chuck remained silent, his focus unbroken. His silence seemed to unnerve Keller more than any retort could have. Harlow, thinking Chuck distracted by Keller's frontal engagement, lunged forward with a cheap shot aimed at Chuck's kidney, the kind of strike meant to disable, to cause pain, rather than to win fairly. Without even fully turning his head, Chuck sensed the approach. He pivoted slightly, caught Harlow's wrist in mid-strike, and used the officer's own momentum to send him stumbling past and into a nearby table. Pastries went flying as Harlow sprawled ungracefully across the surface, his dignity suffering more damage than his body. "That's it," someone shouted from the crowd. "Get him, Chuck!" The chant resumed, louder than before. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" A young woman who'd been recording on her phone turned to her friend. "Did you see how he did that without even looking? Like he had eyes in the back of his head." "My brother's in martial arts," the friend replied. "Says the real masters can feel attacks coming. Something about awareness of space." Meanwhile, Harlow pushed himself up from the ruined pastries, his uniform now stained with cream and fruit filling. His face burned with embarrassment as he tried to brush off the worst of the mess, aware of the many phones capturing his humiliation. Keller, seeing his partner dispatched so easily, changed tactics. His hand moved to his belt, where his baton was holstered. The metal expandable weapon could cause serious damage, even in untrained hands. In the hands of someone with Keller's build and anger, it could be lethal. "Don't, Chuck," said the first word he'd spoken since the physical confrontation began. Something in his tone made several people in the front row take a step back. It wasn't loud or overtly threatening, but it carried absolute certainty, the voice of a man who had faced genuine danger throughout his life and knew precisely what he was capable of. Keller hesitated, hand on the baton. Something in Chuck's tone, not threatening, but absolutely certain gave him pause. "You pull that," Chuck continued quietly, "and this becomes something neither of us wants." The fair had gone eerily quiet. Even the distant music seemed muted, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Maria's knuckles were white around her phone as she continued recording. Elijah had moved closer to Tyrell, one hand on the boy's shoulder, ready to pull him back if the confrontation escalated further. For a moment, it seemed Keller might reconsider. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he realized how far things had already gone and how many witnesses were capturing every moment. Then his face hardened, pride and anger overwhelming judgment, and he yanked the baton free, extending it with a sharp flick of his wrist. The metallic sound of the baton locking into its extended position cut through the silence like a gunshot. "You asked for this," he snarled, and swung the metal baton in a vicious arc toward Chuck's head. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. Maria whispered something that might have been a prayer. Elijah's hand tightened on Tyrell's shoulder. Chuck's response was fluid and precise. He stepped inside the swing, blocked Keller's arm at the wrist, and with a twist that looked deceptively simple, disarmed him. The baton clattered to the ground several feet away, rolling to a stop near the edge of the crowd. No one moved to pick it up. Keller stared at his empty hand in disbelief, then at the baton on the ground, then back at Chuck. The moment stretched, the officer's worldview visibly recalibrating as he confronted a reality his ego had refused to accept until now. "How?" he began, but didn't finish the question as Chuck released his wrist and stepped back, creating distance between them again. 20 years teaching defensive tactics to law enforcement, Chuck said, his breathing still even, as if the exertion had been no more strenuous than a casual walk, including how to properly use and not use a baton. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Someone let out a low whistle of appreciation. "Man, Keller picked the wrong dude to mess with," a teenage boy said to his friends, not bothering to keep his voice down. Harlow had picked himself up from the table, pastry crumbs clinging to his uniform. The defeat in his posture was evident, shoulders slumped. The earlier bravado entirely evaporated. He looked uncertainly toward his partner, then at the crowd surrounding them, then at the many phones recording every moment of their humiliation. Self-preservation was beginning to outweigh loyalty. "Brent?" he said nervously, using Keller's first name for perhaps the first time in public. "Maybe we should." "Shut up," Keller snapped, never taking his eyes off Chuck. His face had flushed a dangerous shade of red, humiliation and rage battling for dominance. "This isn't over." "It could be," Chuck offered quietly. "Right now. No one's seriously hurt. We all walk away." The reasonableness of the offer seemed to infuriate Keller further, as if the very concept of mercy was an additional humiliation. "Like hell," he growled. He charged again, this time aiming lower, attempting to tackle Chuck around the midsection. It was a desperate move, abandoning technique for brute force, trying to use his superior weight and younger strength to overpower the older man. Chuck read the attack before it fully developed. He sidestepped at the last moment, allowing Keller's momentum to carry him past, then stuck out a foot just enough to send the officer sprawling face first onto the pavement. The execution was so clean, so perfectly timed, that it almost appeared choreographed, as if Keller was a willing participant rather than a defeated opponent. A cheer erupted from the crowd. Tyrell was jumping up and down now, his face lit with excitement, momentarily forgetting the seriousness of the situation in the pure thrill of seeing his hero in action. "Did you see that?" he shouted to no one in particular. "Did you see what he did?" Maria couldn't suppress a smile despite her concern. "I got it all on video, Tyrell. Every second." Keller pushed himself up from the ground, a scrape on his cheek beginning to bleed. Dust coated the front of his uniform, and he spat grit from his mouth as he rose. His eyes burned with humiliation and rage, the dangerous look of a man who has lost everything except the desire to inflict pain. This time, when he rose, his hand went directly to his holster. A collective intake of breath from the crowd. The atmosphere shifted instantly from excitement to fear. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, the phone momentarily forgotten. Elijah stepped fully in front of Tyrell now, shielding the boy with his body despite his age. "Don't do it, son," he called to Keller. His voice steady despite the danger. "This has gone far enough." Keller's hand rested on his weapon, his expression locked in a rictus of fury and indecision. His eyes darted between Chuck and the crowd, the last rational part of his mind registering the consequences that would follow if he drew his service weapon in front of so many witnesses. Chuck stood calmly, hands at his sides, watching Keller with the same steady gaze as before. No fear, no anger, just focused awareness and readiness. His posture conveyed absolute confidence without aggression, the stance of a man who had faced armed opponents before and knew exactly what to do if necessary. "Your move, officer," he said quietly. "But think carefully about what happens next." The moment stretched, taut with possibility. Everyone sensed the crossroads before them, how the next few seconds could transform a public confrontation into tragedy. Harlow looked increasingly desperate to be anywhere else, edging backward from the confrontation, unwilling to follow his partner down this dangerous path. The crowd had gone silent again, tension thick in the air. An older man near the front of the crowd spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Son, I was in law enforcement for 30 years. Whatever you're thinking right now, it's not worth your career." Or worse. Whether it was the man's words or Chuck's unwavering gaze or the sheer weight of public witness, something reached through Keller's rage. His hand dropped from his holster, though the fury in his eyes had only intensified. A collective exhale moved through the crowd. Parents who had been pulling children away relaxed slightly. Phones that had lowered in fear raised again to continue recording. "You think this makes you a hero?" Keller spat, voice thick with hatred. "Coming into my town, interfering with police business?" He pointed at the crowd. "You've just taught all these people that it's okay to challenge authority, to disrespect the badge. The badge deserves respect." Chuck agreed, his voice carrying clearly. "But respect is earned through actions, not demanded through fear." A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Several people nodded, exchanging glances that spoke of shared experience times when they had faced similar intimidation but had lacked the means or courage to resist. "Easy for you to say," Keller retorted. "You don't patrol these streets. You don't deal with what we deal with every day." "I've trained officers from departments across this country," Chuck replied. "The good ones understand that strength and intimidation aren't the same thing." He glanced at Elijah, still standing tall despite the earlier rough treatment. "And they certainly know better than to manhandle a 72-year-old man in public without cause." Keller's face twisted. "You don't know anything about me or this town?" "I know what I've seen today," Chuck said simply. Something in his calm certainty seemed to infuriate Keller more than any insult could have. With a wordless snarl, he launched himself at Chuck one more time, all technique abandoned. Just raw fury and wounded pride. It was exactly what Chuck had been waiting for. Keller's hand closed around his service weapon, the leather of his holster creaking as he began to draw it. The sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife, triggering an immediate response. Parents pulled children behind them. Several people stepped back instinctively. Maria's filming hand trembled visibly as she captured what might become evidence in something far more serious than a street confrontation. A collective intake of breath from the crowd. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity as the black metal of the gun began to emerge from its holster. Chuck stood perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Keller's face. There was no fear in his expression, no panic, only a profound focus that seemed to take in everything at once. Keller's trigger finger, the angle of the emerging weapon, the positions of bystanders in potential crossfire, Harlow's stunned paralysis a few feet away. His awareness expanded to encompass the entire scene while remaining laser-focused on the immediate threat. "Officer Keller!" Elijah's voice cut through the tension, steady despite the danger. "Think about what you're doing, son." The old musician had stepped forward, his weathered hand extended in a calming gesture. Despite his 72 years and the rough treatment he'd already endured, his dignity remained intact, his concern seemingly more for Keller than for himself. "This has gone far enough," Elijah continued, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly silent fairground. "Nobody needs to get hurt worse than pride already has." Keller's hand hesitated on his weapon, his gaze darting between Chuck and the crowd. For the first time, he seemed to fully register how many witnesses surrounded them, how many phones were capturing every move. The career-ending implications of drawing his weapon in this situation began to penetrate the fog of his rage. Behind him, Harlow had gone deathly pale, his eyes wide with the realization of how far things had escalated. "Brent," he hissed, his voice cracking with stress. "Don't. For God's sake, don't." Chuck stood calmly, hands at his sides, watching Keller with the same steady gaze as before. No fear, no anger, just focused awareness and readiness. "Your move, officer," he said quietly. "But think carefully about what happens next." Something in his tone, no a threat, but a calm statement of reality, seemed to penetrate Keller's rage. The moment stretched, taut with possibility. Harlow looked increasingly desperate to be anywhere else, edging backward from the confrontation. The crowd had gone silent again, tension thick in the air. A child's voice piped up from somewhere in the back. "Mommy, is the policeman going to shoot Chuck Norris?" The innocent question hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity and danger of the situation. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. Keller's eyes flickered, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. His fingers loosened slightly on his weapon. Across the way, Maria had never stopped filming. "It's all being recorded, Officer Keller," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. Every second. For what seemed like an eternity, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then, with a visible effort, Keller's hand dropped from his holster. The collective relief from the crowd was palpably a sigh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But the fury in Keller's eyes had only intensified, transforming into something cold and calculating. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat, his voice pitched low but carrying in the hushed silence. "Coming into my town? Interfering with police business?" He pointed at the crowd. "You've just taught all these people that it's okay to challenge authority, to disrespect the badge. The badge deserves respect." Chuck agreed, his voice carrying clearly. "But respect is earned through actions, not demanded through fear." A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. An older man near the front nodded emphatically. A young mother whispered something to her child, who looked up at Chuck with wide, admiring eyes. "Easy for you to say," Keller retorted, his breathing still heavy, a thin line of blood tracking down from the scrape on his cheek. "You don't patrol these streets. You don't deal with what we deal with every day. I've trained officers from departments across this country," Chuck replied, his tone neither condescending nor hostile, simply matter of fact. "The good ones understand that strength and intimidation aren't the same thing." He glanced at Elijah, still standing tall despite the earlier rough treatment. "And they certainly know better than to manhandle a 72-year-old man in public without cause." Tyrell had pushed to the front of the crowd again, his young face serious as he listened to the exchange. Other teenagers had gathered around him, their usual adolescent detachment replaced by rapt attention. They were witnessing something they would remember for the rest of their lives, a real-life lesson in power, restraint, and moral courage. Keller's face twisted. "You don't know anything about me or this town. I know what I've seen today," Chuck said simply. Something in his calm certainty seemed to infuriate Keller more than any insult could have. The officer's hands clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening with tension. His jaw worked, grinding teeth audibly as he struggled to contain the rage building inside him. "Officer," Elijah said softly, "it's over. Let it be over." But Keller was beyond reason now. The public humiliation, the loss of face in front of the community he had intimidated for years, the realization that his reputation was forever altered, all coalesced into a white-hot core of fury that demanded release. With a wordless snarl, he launched himself at Chuck one more time, all technique abandoned, just raw rage and wounded pride fueling a desperate final assault. It was exactly what Chuck had been waiting for. Keller's attack was pure rage, uncontrolled, unthinking, and ultimately predictable. He swung wildly, a haymaker that contained all his frustration and humiliation, all his anger at being exposed, at being made to look weak in front of the town he had ruled through fear. Chuck moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades mastering the discipline of combat. There was no wasted energy, no flashy technique, no unnecessary flourish. He stepped slightly to the right, letting Keller's punch sail past, then delivered a single, perfectly placed strike to the officer's midsection. The blow wasn't dramatic or showy. It didn't send Keller flying backward as might happen in a movie. Instead, it was surgical, targeting the solar plexus with just enough force to fold the larger man over, the air rushing from his lungs in a pained gasp that was audible to those nearest the confrontation. Keller dropped to one knee, one arm wrapped around his middle, the other braced against the pavement to keep from collapsing completely. His face contorted with pain and shock, the reality of who he was dealing with finally sinking in. This wasn't about movies or reputation. It was about decades of discipline and training that no amount of bullying or badge-wearing could match. The crowd erupted cheers, applause, and renewed chants of "Chuck, Chuck, Chuck." Phones captured the moment from every angle, ensuring that what had happened here today would spread far beyond San Ignacio by nightfall. Maria's hands trembled as she continued recording, her expression a mixture of awe and vindication. For years, she had watched Keller and officers like him throw their weight around, targeting the vulnerable, using their badges as shields against accountability. Now, finally, someone had stood up, someone they couldn't intimidate or dismiss. Across the crowd, faces reflected similar emotions: relief, amazement, and a dawning sense that something fundamental had shifted in their community. People exchanged glances, nodding to each other, something unspoken but powerful passing between them. Harlow, seeing his partner disabled with a single strike, made a desperate decision. Whatever loyalty or fear had kept him in Keller's shadow for months overrode his better judgment. He lunged forward, baton extended, aiming for Chuck's blind side. But Chuck wasn't blind to anything happening around him. His situational awareness, shown through decades of training and real-world experience, extended to the entire scene. Without even looking, he sensed the approach, the displacement of air, the subtle sounds of movement behind him. He stepped backward at precisely the right moment, and caught Harlow's wrist in a fluid motion that seemed almost casual in its execution. The younger officer's momentum carried him forward into the grip, his eyes widening with the sudden realization of his mistake. A simple twist, not cruel, not punishing, just effective, and the baton clattered to the ground. Another movement, almost too fast to follow, and Harlow found himself on his knees beside his partner, arm immobilized in a joint lock that caused no damage but allowed no escape. "Stay down," Chuck said quietly. "It's over." The words carried no malice, No gloating only, a simple statement of fact. The confrontation had reached its natural conclusion. Further resistance would only lead to more humiliation, perhaps even injury. He released the hold and stepped back, giving both officers space. Neither made any move to rise immediately. Keller was still struggling to catch his breath, his face flushed with exertion and shame. Harlow looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. People who had been filming lowered their phones to applaud. Others exchanged amazed comments, pointing and gesturing as they recounted what they'd just witnessed to latecomers at the edges of the gathering. Terrell had pushed through to the front of the crowd, his young face alight with wonder. "That was amazing," he exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. "You didn't even hit him hard. Just..." He mimicked Chuck's economical movement. "And down he went." Chuck glanced at the boy, the first hint of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. In Terrell's enthusiasm, he recognized something important: not hero worship, but genuine appreciation for the principles behind his actions. "It's not about hitting hard," he said, his voice carrying to those nearby. "It's about hitting smart. Precision over power." The lesson wasn't lost on the gathered onlookers, particularly the younger ones. In a culture that often celebrated brute force and intimidation, Chuck had demonstrated something different: the quiet efficiency of disciplined skill, the moral strength of measured response. Like Mr. Turner says about playing trumpet. Terrell nodded enthusiastically, making the connection immediately. "It's not how loud you play, it's hitting the right notes." "Wise teacher," Chuck replied, looking toward Elijah with genuine respect. The elderly musician inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, his own dignity undiminished by the earlier rough treatment. Despite his age and the stress of the situation, he stood straight, his presence a reminder of the resilience that had carried him through 72 years of life in a world that wasn't always kind to men who looked like him. "The boy's a quick study," Elijah replied, resting a gentle hand on Terrell's shoulder. "Sees connections others miss." The interaction wasn't lost on the crowd. The torch being passed, wisdom from the elderly musician to the young student, reinforced by Chuck's example. 3 generations connected by values that transcended age, race, and circumstance. Maria stepped forward, Chuck's jacket still draped over her arm where he'd handed it to her before the confrontation. "I got it all," she said, holding up her phone. "Every second. Already uploaded to the cloud." The implication was clear: what had happened here wouldn't be buried or denied. Too many witnesses, too much evidence. No quiet disciplinary hearing that would end in a slap on the wrist. No pressure applied to make complaints disappear. Several people in the crowd nodded in confirmation, holding up their own phones. "Got it from 3 different angles," a middle-aged man called out. "Already has 500 views on Twitter," a teenage girl added, looking up from her screen. The digital accountability of the modern age had reached San Ignacio, transforming what might once have been dismissed as hearsay into irrefutable evidence. The power dynamic that had protected officers like Keller for so long was shifting beneath their feet. Keller had managed to regain his breath and was now struggling to his feet, his movements stiff with pain. His face was a mask of fury and embarrassment, the scratch on his cheek still oozing blood, his pristine uniform now dusty and disheveled. "This isn't over," he growled, though the threat sounded hollow now, stripped of the authority that had once given his words weight. "Yes, it is," Chuck replied, not unkindly. "For today, at least." The distinction was important. This wasn't the end of systemic problems, just one confrontation. Real change would require more than a single moment of accountability, more than one viral video. But it was a start, a crack in the wall of impunity that had protected abuses of power for too long. Chuck turned to Elijah. "Are you all right, sir?" The question was simple, but carried genuine concern. Despite the attention focused on the confrontation with the officers, Chuck hadn't forgotten the original injustice that had prompted his intervention. "Better than these two," Elijah answered with a slight smile, gesturing toward the disheveled officers. "Though I suspect I'll be feeling that arm tomorrow." The comment drew a few chuckles from the crowd, tension releasing through humor. The atmosphere had shifted. The fear that had gripped the gathering earlier, now replaced by a cautious sense of justice served. At least for the moment. Chuck nodded, then addressed the crowd, his voice carrying without being raised. "The fair's not over, folks. Might be a good time to enjoy what's left of the afternoon." It was a gentle dismissal, and remarkably, it worked. The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered at a distance, phones still recording, conversations buzzing with excitement. Parents led children back toward the rides and game booths. Vendors who had abandoned their stations during the confrontation returned to their posts. Keller had retrieved his badge from where it had fallen during the scuffle, brushing off dust before clipping it back to his uniform. His hands shook slightly, whether from exertion or anger wasn't clear. The symbol of authority that had shielded him for so long now seemed diminished somehow. Its power to intimidate, lessened by the events of the past half hour. "You've made an enemy today," he said quietly to Chuck, his voice pitched low enough that only those nearest could hear. "Didn't come here looking for friends or enemies," Chuck replied evenly. "Just came for the fair." The simple statement seemed to irritate Keller further, highlighting, as it did, the accidental nature of the confrontation. Chuck hadn't sought this out. He'd simply refused to look away when faced with injustice. Harlow tugged at his partner's sleeve, his expression anxious. "Brent, we should go. There's too many witnesses." The younger officer's voice trembled with the realization of what had just happened, and what it might mean for their careers. The invulnerability they had taken for granted had been shattered in full public view. Keller shook off Harlow's hand, but seemed to recognize the wisdom of retreat. With a final glare at Chuck, then at Elijah, he turned and began walking away. Harlow hurried after him, not meeting anyone's eyes. As the officers departed, the tension that had gripped the gathering began to dissolve. Laughter and conversation resumed. Someone turned the music back on a Latin jazz number that seemed perfectly suited to the moment, its rhythm suggesting life continuing, moving forward despite the interruption. Children who had been kept back by worried parents were allowed to return to the festivities. The charity fair reclaimed its original purpose, a community gathering on a warm Texas afternoon, neighbors coming together to support local causes. But beneath the resuming normality, something had changed. The confrontation had exposed the fault lines running through San Ignacio, the unspoken hierarchies and abuses that many had accepted as unchangeable. For the first time, people were talking openly about what they had witnessed, not just today, but over the years. Remember when they arrested Miguel's boy for just sitting in the park? Or when they confiscated Rosa's entire day's earnings because her permit was illegible? "My brother got pulled over 3 times in 1 week last month. No ticket. Just harassment." Stories that had been whispered were now being spoken aloud, shared between neighbors who had previously kept their experiences private. The fear that had enforced silence was weakening, at least for now. And in the middle of it all stood Chuck Norris, not as a celebrity or action hero, but as an ordinary citizen who had chosen to step forward when others stepped back. His example had revealed something important, that moral courage wasn't about being fearless or special, but about being unwilling to look away when confronted with wrong. Elijah caught his eye across the crowd and nodded, one gesture of profound respect and gratitude that required no words. In that silent exchange passed an understanding that transcended their different lives and backgrounds. Sometimes justice came from unexpected places. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fairgrounds as Chuck Norris sat at a small table with Elijah Turner. Maria had insisted on bringing them fresh lemonade and her remaining unscattered pastries, refusing any payment with a firm shake of her head. "My family will be talking about this day for generations," she had said, her eyes still bright with the excitement of it all. That's payment enough. Now she was busy at her booth, surrounded by a steady stream of customers, many of whom kept glancing over at Chuck and Elijah with poorly disguised curiosity. "You didn't have to step in," Elijah said, his weathered hands wrapped around the cool glass. "But I'm grateful you did." Chuck shrugged slightly. "Couldn't just watch." "Most people do," Elijah replied. "Watch, I mean. It's safer." "Safe isn't always right." The two men shared a look of understanding that transcended the differences in their lives and backgrounds, a recognition of shared values that needed no elaboration. Nearby, Tyrell was recounting the confrontation to a group of wide-eyed teenagers, his hands gesturing animatedly as he described Chuck's movements. He didn't even have to hit them hard. It was like he knew exactly where to touch them, to just shut them down. Chuck smiled faintly at the boy's enthusiasm. "Your student?" he asked Elijah. "Going on 3 years now." Elijah nodded. "Gifted trumpet player. Even better human being. Good combination. The best," Elijah agreed. "Kids like Tyrell there, why I stayed in San Ignacio. When my wife passed, I thought about moving back to New Orleans. But I realized my roots had grown here, around these children and their music." Across the fairgrounds, phones buzzed and chimed as Maria's video spread like wildfire through social media and text messages. People huddled in small groups, heads bent over screens, exclaiming and pointing. Occasionally someone would look up, spot Chuck, and nudge their companions. "You might have trouble leaving town without signing some autographs," Elijah observed. "Wouldn't be the first time," Chuck replied, though he seemed genuinely unbothered by the attention. "Small price to pay. What brought you to our little fair anyway, if you don't mind my asking?" Chuck took a sip of lemonade before answering. "I support music programs for at-risk youth. Heard about what you've been doing here, turning your garage into a studio, giving free lessons. Thought I'd see it firsthand. Maybe make a quiet donation." Elijah's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's unexpected. My foundation tries to stay under the radar. More effective that way." Before Elijah could respond, Maria hurried over, her expression tense. "They're back," she said quietly, "with reinforcements." Chuck and Elijah turned to see Keller and Harlow approaching from the direction of the police station. Behind them walked a heavy-set man in his 50s, wearing a police uniform with captain's bars and a face like a thundercloud. "Captain Mercer," Elijah murmured. "Keller's uncle by marriage. Not a good sign." The crowd parted before the three officers, conversations dying as they passed. Phones appeared again, recording the new development. Chuck stood unhurriedly, positioning himself slightly in front of Elijah. Not confrontational, but protective. Captain Mercer stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving between Chuck and Elijah before settling on the former. Up close, his resemblance to Keller was noticeable, the same hard set to the jaw, the same calculating eyes. But where Keller was all brash aggression, Mercer carried the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through more subtle means. "Mr. Norris," he said, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of a lifelong Texan. "Quite a surprise to find you in San Ignacio." "Captain," Chuck acknowledged with a slight nod. "I understand there was some misunderstanding between you and my officers earlier." "No misunderstanding," Chuck replied evenly. "They were harassing an elderly man without cause. I intervened." Mercer's expression tightened momentarily before he forced a smile. "Well, I'm sure you thought you were doing the right thing. But in the future, perhaps leave police matters to the police. Perhaps your officers could leave innocent citizens alone." Elijah spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. Mercer turned his attention to Elijah, his smile becoming noticeably cooler. "Mr. Turner. Always in the middle of trouble, aren't you?" "Only when trouble comes looking for me, Captain." Behind Mercer, Keller stared at Chuck with undisguised hostility. A bruise was beginning to form on his cheekbone where he'd hit the pavement, and he stood slightly hunched, still feeling the effects of Chuck's strike to his midsection. Harlow looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, his gaze darting nervously between Chuck and the growing crowd of onlookers. "I've reviewed the situation," Mercer continued, addressing Chuck again, "and I believe we can all agree that things got out of hand." Heat of the moment, tensions running high. "There's video," Maria interjected, stepping forward. "Multiple videos. Everything that happened is documented." Mercer's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Miss Velasquez, isn't it? I believe your booth permit expires in—" He made a show of checking his watch. "About 30 minutes. You'll want to start packing up soon." The threat was thinly veiled. Maria's chin lifted defiantly. "My permit's good until 6, she replied, "and I have the receipt to prove it." "Paperwork gets lost," Mercer shrugged. "Mistakes happen." "Not this time," Chuck said, his voice still calm, but carrying a new edge. "Too many witnesses. Too much evidence." Mercer turned back to Chuck, his facade of politeness slipping slightly. "Mr. Norris, you may be a celebrity, but this is my town, my department, and I don't appreciate outsiders coming in and undermining my officers' authority." "Your officers undermined their own authority," Chuck replied, "when they decided to abuse it." The two men stood facing each other, neither giving ground. Around them, the crowd had grown larger and more attentive, a ring of witnesses with phones held high. From somewhere in that ring, Tyrell's voice rang out. "The videos are already all over Twitter and Facebook, Captain. My cousin in El Paso just texted me about it." A murmur ran through the crowd as others confirmed the story was spreading beyond San Ignacio, beyond their control. Mercer's face darkened. He turned to glare at Keller and Harlow, clearly blaming them for the public relations disaster unfolding. "We're not finished with this," he said to Chuck, his voice low. "Celebrity or not, interfering with police business has consequences. So does police brutality," Elijah countered. "Something this town has overlooked for too long." Mercer's attention snapped back to Elijah, his expression hardening into something ugly. "Careful, old man. Your record isn't as clean as you pretend." "My record is the truth," Elijah said simply. "And now, finally, people are seeing it." A new voice spoke up from the crowd, strong, female, authoritative. "Captain Mercer." The crowd parted to reveal a tall woman in her 40s, dressed in a crisp pantsuit despite the heat. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. "District Attorney Reyes," Mercer acknowledged, his tone carefully neutral. "This is a police matter. It became my matter the moment I received 17 different videos of your officers assaulting a senior citizen," Reyes replied, coming to stand beside Chuck and Elijah. "And then being subdued after escalating to deadly force. They were conducting a routine check." "Save it for the review board, Captain." Reyes cut him off. "Officers Keller and Harlow are suspended. Effective immediately. Badges and service weapons to be surrendered before they leave the fairgrounds." Keller's face contorted with rage. "You can't do that." "She can," Chuck said quietly. "And she should." "This isn't over," Keller snarled, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. "Touch that weapon," Reyes said coldly, "and your career ends right now instead of after due process." For a tense moment, it seemed Keller might defy her. Then Mercer placed a restraining hand on his nephew's arm. "Stand down, officer," he ordered. "That's an order." Keller's hand dropped, but the hatred in his eyes as he glared at Chuck hadn't diminished. "Your badges," Reyes repeated, holding out her hand. With visible reluctance, Harlow unclipped his badge first, placing it in the DA's palm without meeting her eyes. After a longer hesitation, Keller did the same, the movement stiff with suppressed fury. "Report to my office at 9 tomorrow morning," Reyes instructed. "Both of you. We'll discuss next steps then." She turned to Mercer. "Captain, I'll expect your incident report on my desk by the same time." Mercer's expression was carefully blank now. Professional mask firmly in place. "Of course, Counselor." With a final nod to Chuck and Elijah, Reyes turned and walked away, the crowd once again parting before her. Mercer eyed Chuck with barely concealed resentment. "Enjoy your moment, Mr. Norris, but remember you're just passing through. The rest of us live here." Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode away. After a moment's hesitation, Keller and Harlow followed, the former's shoulders rigid with humiliation, the latter's slumped in defeat. As they disappeared into the crowd, a collective breath seemed to release from the gathered onlookers. Conversations resumed, louder now, buzzing with excitement and disbelief. "Did that just happen? District Attorney just shut them down? Did you see Keller's face?" Maria let out a low whistle. "Day Reyes doesn't mess around. I've never seen her at the fair before." "She was already here," a woman nearby volunteered. "My sister works in her office," said Reyes came to judge the salsa contest. "Lucky timing," Elijah remarked. "For once," Maria agreed. The late afternoon was giving way to evening now, the heat finally relenting as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The confrontation seemed to have energized rather than dampened the fair. If anything, the crowds had grown, drawn by the spreading news of what had occurred. Tyrell pushed his way back to their table, practically vibrating with excitement. "Mr. Turner, the video's gone viral. My cousin said it's got over 50,000 views already. And people are talking about police stuff in other towns too, saying this happens all the time but nobody famous is usually there to stop it." Elijah nodded soberly. "That's the truth of it, son. What happened today isn't rare. What's rare is that someone stepped in." He glanced at Chuck. Someone people couldn't ignore. Chuck had reclaimed his seat, seemingly unaffected by the attention swirling around him. "Might not have changed anything," he said. "One incident doesn't fix a broken system." "Maybe not," Maria agreed, joining them at the table. "But it's a crack in the wall. And sometimes that's all you need to start bringing the whole thing down." She nodded toward where groups of residents were talking animatedly, sharing the videos, comparing accounts of what they'd witnessed. "Look at them. They're not afraid anymore. At least not right now. They're angry. They're talking. That's how change starts." Chuck considered this, then gave a slight nod. "Hope you're right." "What happens next?" Tyrell asked, looking between the adults. "Will those officers go to jail?" "Justice isn't always that simple," Elijah said gently. "But they'll face consequences they've never had to face before. And that's a start." Chuck reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, handing it to Elijah. "My foundation's information. We support community programs, legal defense funds. If you or anyone else has trouble from this," he glanced in the direction the officers had gone, "call that number. Help will come." Elijah accepted the card, studying it briefly before tucking it carefully into his shirt pocket. "Thank you. Not just for this, but for what you did today." "Did what anyone should have done," Chuck replied. "But they didn't," Maria pointed out. "You did." Chuck didn't argue the point. Instead, he rose from his seat, glancing at the darkening sky. "Should be heading out. Long drive ahead." "You're welcome to stay," Elijah offered. "My guest room isn't fancy, but it's comfortable." Chuck smiled. genuine, warm expression that softened the lines of his face. "Appreciate the offer, but I've got commitments tomorrow. Another time." He extended his hand to Elijah, who clasped it firmly. The two men, different in background and experience but connected now by the events of the day, shared a look of mutual respect. Tyrell stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Norris? Would it be okay if I took a picture with you? Nobody at school will believe this otherwise." "Of course," Chuck agreed, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder as Maria snapped several photos with her phone. "What you did today," Tyrell said, his young face suddenly serious. "That's what real strength is, isn't it? Not just being able to fight, but knowing when you have to." Chuck studied the boy thoughtfully. "That's exactly right. And don't let anyone tell you different." As Chuck made his way toward the fair's exit, people stopped to thank him, to shake his hand, to snap quick photos. He accepted it all with grace but didn't linger, maintaining the same quiet purpose with which he'd arrived hours earlier. At the edge of the fairgrounds, he paused, looking back at the scene, the lights coming on as darkness fell, the music playing. The community gathered in celebration that now carried an undercurrent of something more significant. Elijah had moved to the small stage where Tyrell and his friends had set up earlier. The old musician picked up a saxophone, tested it with a few notes, then began to play a soulful, bluesy tune that seemed to capture everything that had happened. The tension, the confrontation, the resolution, and the uncertain but hopeful path forward. Chuck listened for a moment, then turned and continued on his way, disappearing into the Texas night as quietly as he had appeared. But San Ignacio would remember. The videos would spread, questions would be asked that had long been avoided, conversations would begin that had been silenced before. And perhaps in time, real change would come to this small border town, not from the dramatic intervention of an aging action hero, but from the courage his example had sparked in ordinary people who had witnessed something extraordinary. The quiet strength of integrity facing down the loud bluster of intimidation. Justice, moral courage, and the power of a single person willing to stand up when others would not. These were the lessons of the day, lessons that would echo long after the fair had ended and life in San Ignacio returned to its normal rhythms. Lessons that, like Elijah's music floating through the evening air, carried both the pain of what had been and the promise of what might yet be. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.